Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Keep Your Delivery Processes Secure with Database DevOps. First off, a little housekeeping. All the attendees are going to be on mute during the webinar, but we absolutely want to hear your questions. So if you have any during the course of the presentation, just enter the question into the question box and we'll make sure we leave time at the end to go through them. We are also recording this webinar and we'll follow up with a copy of the recording as well as the slides over the next couple of days. My name is Brian McRae. I'm a pre-sales engineer here with Redgate Software, and for the past 25 years I've worked in various roles in IT, ranging from software engineer to development manager to database architect, like many of you joining the call today. But now I'm responsible for helping clients across a range of industries securely automate their database development, their change management, and their continuous integration and deployment processes. DevOps is obviously a key focus for the majority of these conversations, but as IT teams are under increasing pressure to demonstrate data privacy and protection with regulation like GDPR, HIPAA, SOX, etc., I wanted to focus today's webinar on how you can combine these two areas and extend one to embrace the other without compromising on either side. Ultimately, I hope you leave today's webinar with an understanding of how Database DevOps can ensure you continue to increase the speed of delivery securely and do so without jeopardizing compliance. For those of you who may not know Redgate, we've been around for just over 18 years and we've got over 200,000 customers now. We help companies improve the quality and efficiency of their SQL Server database development and deployment processes. We maintain two communities, one SQL Server Central, the other called Simple Talk. And these hubs are a massive presence in the database development community. We share best practices, learnings, and we help solve problems within our customers and without. We also very much walk the DevOps walk. We have over 1,100 major and minor product releases in the last year alone. This number is going to continue to increase year over year as we fully invest in DevOps from end to end. Our customers range from global corporations, 91 out of the Fortune 100 use our tools, to single-person shops and everything in between. So there are lots of definitions of DevOps out there, and I thought it made sense to kind of level set. And I'll give you one of my favorite, personal favorite DevOps definitions, and it's from Donovan Brown. Donovan is the DevOps lead at Microsoft, and he defines DevOps as the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And the key things to mention here are the people, the process, and the products. These all go hand in hand. DevOps is a cultural shift. It's a transition. And without collaborating across these three elements, I don't believe you can truly achieve DevOps. And while many of us and many of you may be adopting DevOps at the application and maybe even infrastructure tiers, the database is often seen as a bottleneck and therefore left behind. In fact, how many of you have your database release schedules that are on par with your DevOps development teams? And I expect there are quite a few of us who are shaking our heads vehemently no, and you're not alone. Most of the database professionals I talk to every day are in the same boat. So you couple that with increasing regulation around data security, and it's forcing software teams to put reliable, repeatable, secure, and therefore auditable development processes in place to meet these requirements of the GDPR, of HIPAA, SOX, and other regulatory. This is where Redgate comes in. We believe that you can effectively bring DevOps to the database and as a result, increase the speed of delivery, the quality of releases while improving compliance at the same time. Although the major focus of today's conversation is on the recent UK legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, countries around the world are starting to take data privacy and protection very seriously, and there are varying degrees of legislation currently in place or on the horizon, but most of the world, especially North America, Europe, and Australia, already have significant legislation in place. And the scope of these laws are also narrowing as states and local municipalities add their own data privacy laws. New York State, for example, recently implemented a new regulation called Cybersecurity Requirements for Financial Services Companies, which any insurance or financial services company doing business in New York is subject to. The environment is changing, and it's changing rapidly. This change and its pace are going to have a profound impact on how global businesses are required to approach the collection and management of personal information. And note the GDPR in particular applies universally. It doesn't just apply to those of you who may be in the EU. The legislation is relevant to any organization that holds data on EU citizens. And it doesn't matter if a financial transaction takes place here either. If an organization offers goods or services, or even just monitors the behavior of an EU citizen, then this falls into the scope of the GDPR. And one of the major components of the GDPR is the idea of data protection by design and by default. And this is defined very clearly as a general obligation to implement technical and organizational measures to show that you have considered and integrated data protection into your processing activities. And the key here is to show that you thought about it up front and taken steps to protect the data. It's too late to come up with a plan after the event. You must be able to show evidence of upfront planning. Now, as well as embedding privacy by design into your database development and testing process, the GDPR also states that the organization shall only process personal data for the specific purpose of the processing, such as a financial transaction. That means that the controller has to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring this, and that these measures must evidence that we have no personal data being used for our internal testing purposes. This GDPR requirement of data protection by design and default actually aligns really well with the core fundamentals of DevOps, because having a reliable, repeatable, and therefore auditable process provides a solid foundation to which we can meet this requirement. In addition to this, by extending DevOps practices to the database, we no longer have to wait until the point of release, until that application hits the production database to see how our software is going to behave. We know what to expect, and we can therefore reduce the risk of chaotic or even catastrophic software releases. We'll dive into some of these key principles of DevOps shortly, including how you can establish production-like development and test environments with realistic and yet masked data sets for use in your development and testing activities. How practices like version control and build and release automation can help us increase our ability to deliver value at speed while also increasing reliability. And finally, how to be proactive about performance monitoring so that you can plan for the future and be ready when something goes wrong. We recently completed a State of DevOps, Database DevOps report, something we do every year. And in this report, we conduct a number of surveys. One survey here was we asked the question, what impact do you think Database DevOps has on your regulatory and compliance requirements? And 63% of our respondents said that a DevOps approach to the database, in fact, has a positive impact on compliance requirements. And this is likely because DevOps introduces managed processes that simplify this compliance by enabling software to be delivered in a consistent, reliable, and repeatable way, and providing an audit trail of the changes that have been made. As expected, the number of people who think DevOps has a positive impact on compliance rises in organizations operating in more regulated environments like healthcare, medical, pharmaceuticals, financial services. Interestingly, the percentage also varies significantly between those who have already adopted a DevOps approach for some or all of their projects, about 69% of respondents, and those who have not and have no plans to, about 38%. This strongly suggests that organizations that implement DevOps practices are finding DevOps to be good for compliance. So we've established that data privacy here absolutely has a role to play in DevOps, and that a successful data governance program can be the key to ensuring that all relevant people and processes are aligned and therefore delivering maximum value to the business without compromising on security. And this application and deployment pipeline is the diagram that you may have seen. That's a very DevOps-centric diagram that you may have seen in other areas, but we want to talk about this in terms and scope of the database and the application. And the idea here is that in our application and database deployment pipeline, we can support database developers doing simple database changes, full stack developers doing changes across the board. And all of these changes, application and database, are tracked by source control. And yes, you can and very much should source control your database. We run continuous integration processes consistently or constantly, and we either schedule them or they're triggered based on an event in the development lifecycle, like checking my code into source control. These changes are then propagated through higher environments as part of the release, continuous delivery, and deployment processes. And this process is designed to be automated end-to-end to enable that truly continuous integration and deployment, but that's not always feasible. So many shops have manual intervention or review steps in place prior to moving changes into production. So automation remains a key part of the DevOps story, but of course, there is much more to consider. This brings me to our second diagram. This is Redgate's database development process, and we're essentially extending the previous diagram to include some additional tools and processes to help you complete the picture. So across the top, you'll see the familiar automation pipeline for deploying changes, and we add a few steps across the bottom which extend your process to include, first of all, proactive monitoring. so that we can optimize your database performance, detect odd behavior, backup chain to take that environment as a source, and then a provision process to remove any of that sensitive data that may exist before we feed sanitized versions of that production database back into the development process. So we're going to take a brief poll here, just out of curiosity. What would you guys consider to be the greatest challenge in integrating the database into your DevOps process? Please respond to the poll above. All right, thank you for your responses. So in this now, we want to talk about one of the first steps of the database DevOps process, which is provisioning. And when we talk about provisioning here at Redgate, what we're talking about is the idea of providing developer-dedicated database copies to improve the efficiency and quality of database development and testing. This is becoming increasingly common as companies seek to introduce more DevOps-centric practices. So working with a copy of production data enables developers to write better quality code. You can find errors faster, and it also prevents environment consistency problems when you're deploying changes across environments. However, it's also time and disk space intensive to provision these copies. So shared databases from old backups are often used, which, as you know, become increasingly unreliable and outdated over time. In some recent research we conducted here at Redgate, we wanted to identify how organizations currently provision databases and also to assess the importance of provisioning requirements to ensure adherence to these emerging data protection obligations. So we gathered responses from about 500 people, a wide variety of job roles and a wide variety of industries. And you can see one of the findings on the screen now. Software teams want to use production data. 83% of respondents either somewhat or strongly agree that they want to use production data in their development and testing. And this is not a surprise because it's more predictable, more reliable, but it's also not compliant. So given this need for production data, the next stat may not come as a surprise, but the numbers are still quite shocking. 72% of people use a direct copy of production. Let me say that again. 72% of people use a direct copy of production in their development, test, and QA environments. And interestingly, those who were restricted from using prod data were mainly due to the data sensitivity and regulatory requirements that already exist through HIPAA, SOX, et cetera. So they're already used to taking more precautionary measures with your data. And so again, another poll here, I'm going to ask you guys the same question. Where do you fall in this category? Do you guys use direct copies of production for development and testing, or do you already have some process in place to encrypt and privatize that data in some way? Okay, so we have an advanced crowd. It looks like 63% of you are always masking the data before that you're moving from production into development environment. So good on you. That means you guys are ahead of the curve. So our SQL Provision, Redgate SQL Provision, we support this database DevOps approach while keeping compliance central to this whole process. So we have this virtual cloning technology in SQL Clone that allows you to create database copies in seconds and create them at 10 to 15% of the source database size. We can take sensitive data in these databases and anonymize it or replace it with realistic data using Data Masker. That way we ensure data is protected as it moves between environments. And with a central management system for provisioning, this entire process, again, is simple, it's repeatable, transparent, and auditable. As we've seen from an earlier slide of the research we conducted on database provisioning, 83% of us agreed or strongly agreed that it's desirable to use production data in development and testing, and now they can do so, knowing that data security, regulatory compliance, and storage concerns have been accommodated. And one additional thing here regarding Data Masker and anonymizing data, it's also important that when we are anonymizing this information, that we provide data that is as close to production as possible. In other words, the closer we can get the data to look like production data, to act like production data, the more efficient, the more effective our development and testing activities will be. So now that you've provisioned a copy of your database and you start working with this copy in development, and this whole idea of a dedicated development database, I'm a single database developer, I get my own dedicated copy of a database for development, and this whole approach provides you with a great deal of flexibility because it allows the developer to make these changes in a private sandbox environment. And when you couple that with source control, the developer can use source control to pick and choose the database object changes that they're ready to promote, and that therefore maintains that extra layer of indirection between the development and production systems. And so this combination of dedicated development databases coupled with source control and all the process discipline source control brings with it, this is fundamental to a successful and compliant database development process. So in Redgate's last State of the Database DevOps report, we asked people what practices they put in place for the application versus what they do for the database. And you'll notice that in the graph, there's a 30% gap in the adoption of source control between the application and database development, with just over half of the respondents stating that they had source control in place for the database, compared with over 80% adoption of source control at the application tier. So unsurprisingly, given the previous slide, there are significantly more third-party tooling options out there, and therefore third-party tooling in place at the application tier than for the database. In fact, 61% of our respondents have a third-party tool in place for source control at the application tier, but only 40% for the database. And if these figures look familiar, they might represent what's going on in your organization. You'll likely want to address it if you're going to increase the speed of delivery and also make sure you're staying compliant. Version controlling the database alongside the application is not only possible, it delivers many advantages. So using tools like Redgate's source control allows you to synchronize your database structure across the development, test, and production environments, reduces the work and the errors involved. Additionally, it ensures database development teams communicate changes with others. It provides a version to roll back to if required and helps you maintain that solid audit trail. So our second tip for ensuring secure database development is version control. Discover bugs earlier in the process to improve software quality and log build results to make it easier to build audit trails. So when we talk about automation, there's really two key areas I want to touch on in this section: automated testing and automated build and release. Many application developers are already using continuous integration to automatically test their code and build release management tools to automate the deployment process. Database developers can join them, and the result is continuous delivery for the database. Continuous delivery extends DevOps thinking from software development through to deployment. Rather than regarding the release of software as a separate activity, continuous delivery means software is always ready for release. Additional data management, monitoring processes may be required to safeguard data, and we'll discuss that next, but the broader benefits of continuous delivery gained by standardizing deployment processes through automation remain the same for the database. By automating these onerous processes so they are quick, reliable, and predictable, it makes it easier to deliver software faster and also makes dealing with compliance more straightforward. With automation, you are less likely to introduce human error. Tests are more efficient, your process is more consistent and therefore more predictable, and that makes it more auditable. So let's look back at the graphs I showed you earlier. Again, you'll notice that automation is significantly higher for the application than for the database. And when you look at third-party tooling again, a huge difference between those who are using automated testing for the application, 30%, and those who may be doing the same for the database, 12%. So I recently attended a conference with a number of highly experienced database developers and architects who were there. These conferences are always interesting because you definitely get a sense of the collective mind share of what's going on across the environment of this profession that we love. And one of the most interesting conversations that I had repeatedly was around extending these DevOps type practices into the database. And last year, the conversations were, for lack of a better word, skeptical in nature. You guys really can't do this. You're going to have to prove to me how types of conversations. But this year it's been very different. This year, database professionals are coming to us and talking about the speed in which their infrastructure and application teams are able to move, and how that contrasts with the longer development cycles, the longer deployment cycles, and the high degree of manual work that it takes to manage database releases. And now what's happening is these database organizations are being pressed by their application and infrastructure teams to move more quickly. And I had the same conversation at least a dozen times over the course of a couple of days. So just a finger on the pulse, kind of across the board of the industry, this is a very common conversation, a very common need, and something that we're all looking forward to addressing as database professionals. And so one key component, once you get those changes and once you've automated those changes and now you have changes moving to production on a regular scheduled basis, is the ability to monitor and monitor effectively. Because once upon a time, a data breach was considered to be an event where a third party had gained access, unauthorized access to held data. However, with these new rules around this whole idea of the right to be forgotten, you now have to add to that the fact that an event when you lose access to your own data, now that's considered a breach. And so you've got to follow the same set of predefined responses. So both of these situations rely on our ability to have real-time information based on the state and activities of our database environments, or more specifically, proactive database monitoring in place. So another quick poll question here. Monitoring is a big subject, and there's obviously lots and lots of things we can monitor, but I want to hear from you guys about what aspects of database monitoring are going to be most important to you in your day-to-day business operations. So it looks like the results are split about 60% or 60%, 40% to diagnosing, in other words, diagnosing and preventing recurring issues, and then about 40% to being alerted to errors and issues. So pretty consistent with what we've seen across the board as well, and I think two of the most key important parts of monitoring. So 50% of our respondents say security is a key daily responsibility. And we've already talked about GDPR and how it ranks highest on the list of security and protection challenges. But interestingly, the majority of us are still firefighting rather than proactive monitoring. And with the right monitoring tool in place, you can catch these deployment errors. You can pardon me, slight technical difficulty there. You guys should be able to see my screen again. So with this right monitoring tool in place, you can catch deployment errors, you can diagnose issues faster, and more importantly, prevent them from recurring. And then you can also track and plan your growing SQL Server estate, even do things like catch unexpected or unauthorized access to your servers. Some of those frequently cited causes of problems, things like running out of capacity, bad deployments, or ad hoc user access, all suggest that our survey respondents too often find themselves having to firefight rather than proactively monitoring and managing the database activity. And this is backed up by aspects of SQL Server monitoring that were most important to our respondents, being alerted to errors, issues, and diagnosing those current issues, to name the top two. These are exactly the areas where a third-party tool can help you. Now, Redgate SQL Monitor is a web-based monitoring tool that helps teams looking after your SQL Server estates to be more proactive. So not only do we provide you with the general monitoring to alert you to current issues, we can give you the information that you need to find the exact cause of the problem and also diagnose how you might fix it in the future. And now our monitoring integrates with our deployment tools to allow you for some additional context to be given on how and when releases have been run, and allow you to monitor those activities right alongside day to day. So what we've talked about today over the last few minutes is we've talked about how you can bring a complete database DevOps process to your architecture. And a few things to touch on here. We talked about provisioning and masking. In other words, how you can take and be able to make copies of production-like data to be able to fully anonymize that and then distribute that to your development and testing organizations. We talked about using source control and how source control is a key component of helping you manage change across the organization. Build and release automation, a huge component of DevOps and a great increase both in productivity, but also that automation means process consistency. And that process consistency means it's a whole lot easier to audit. And then finally, monitoring, that key component to help you with resilience. And so all these things that we talked about today, Redgate has a series or suite of tools to address each one of them, many of which you may have known about. But our total goal here is to keep you compliant, to make sure that you are able to provision your databases and provision database changes at the same speed as your application tiers can. There is one other anecdote that I'll leave you with, and this is a conversation that I had with a medical technology company just yesterday. And medical technology companies, they've been, HIPAA's been around for quite some time, and so these organizations have become both mature and pretty adept at handling data consistency, data access, and data privacy. And one of the biggest concerns that the CIO of this company said out loud was that the cost, both the financial cost and also the resource cost to harden these databases that contain personal information. And so for instance, his patient databases, well, any database, whether it's a development database, a test database, a QA database, or a production database, if it has personally identifiable information in it, it must be locked down. So they have to harden it, they have to encrypt it, they have to mask it, they have to do all the things, spend all the time, all the money, and all the resources on all of their databases. So when we were looking at provisioning in particular, provisioning plus the ability to mask that data and privatize it, well, now our ability to do that means that he can fully mask his test and development environments, meaning that those environments no longer contain PII. And if they no longer contain PII, they don't have to be hardened. They don't have to go through that same process, that same difficult and financially expensive and resource-intensive process of hardening that database and securing access. And so that benefit alone is worthwhile, certainly worthwhile in working to integrate this type of compliant process into your stack. And so I wanted to leave you with that, just a little bit of a live story. What I wanted to do now is just open this up to any questions that you guys might have. You can type in your questions down in the question text, and I'll be able to see them here. So definitely interested in both your views and some of the things that you may be interested in. So I got one question here from, it's about the penalties. That's a great question. So what are the penalties if a company violates the tenets of the GDPR? It's a great question. So the penalties are at the very high end. The GDPR has the discretion to levy up to a £20 million penalty or 4% of the company's annual revenue, whichever is greater. And so the penalties get pretty steep when you start thinking about that. Thank you guys for that question. Certainly interested in any others you may have. Okay, here's another one regarding change automation within your database. And this is another very common challenge that we run into is how we handle database environment changes in migration-heavy environments. In other words, database changes that require significant data migration. That is an enormous challenge, as you guys know. It's a challenge that the industry has been facing for quite some time. But we actually have developed a couple of different approaches. In fact, if you look on the wheel on the slide here, you'll see the DLM automation and also Redgate. Those are two separate products that do the same thing. They're both designed to integrate with your build and release systems and help you both build changes and also release those changes to your higher environments. We have one of those products, Redgate in particular, takes that migration-based approach and works best in instances where you're dealing with more complex changes and more of a rapid pace, where the DLM automation takes what we call more of a state-based approach. In other words, for things like schemas and for programmable objects, those we can treat almost like code. And when we put those in source control, we can almost recreate them out of thin air. So that state-based approach works really well when you're not making changes that are going to require significant data migrations. But I think this whole idea of, as we get closer and closer and closer to true build and release automation, one of the biggest challenges that we've always faced as database professionals is keeping environments consistent from dev, test to production, but also that entire process of keeping your data safe, keeping it and migrating it effectively when you make these changes. This is something that we've been facing ever since databases were databases, but with Redgate, we're getting closer and closer and closer to being able to solve it. So thank you guys for that question. So I've got a couple of questions here on how this is actually implemented, and if you're interested in more information, that's definitely let us know. I am a sales engineer, so I actually work on the front side of most of our engagements as the technical primary point of contact. So I actually work with the DBAs like yourselves. And our objective when we first begin interacting with you is to fully understand your environment, to see where we can lay over some of the higher level information that we spoke about today, where we can lay these processes over what you may be doing now. And so you can absolutely put an inquiry into the website. You are also free to, if you'd like, put your name and email address into the question box, and we can make sure that it gets routed to the appropriate contact, and we'll reach out to you directly. Okay, looks like there are no other questions. So thank you all so much for attending this morning's webinar. We really, really appreciate it. And please come give us a look at Redgate, and we would be happy to help you bring DevOps to your database and help you keep your database processes fully compliant. Thank you all so much.